Sorry, I'm going to just sort of start over a little bit here. We're taking things online this year with our fall Fairhaven lecture series. And typically, we would hold the series at Fairhaven Senior Services in Whitewater and have been holding the series since 1983. But this year, we are taking things online. This lecture today is our second in our series, which is focusing on the 2020 election. There's lots to talk about, as there always is with this topic, and there's more to talk about every single day. We are recording the lecture, so if you're live, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Please, if you have any questions along the way, you can put them in the chat box and we'll save them until the end of the lecture and go through the questions at that time. And if you're watching this video down the road, we are recording it for folks who can't join us today. But enough of my talking. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Corey Davis is a professor and the graduate program coordinator in the Department of Communication at UW-Whitewater, where he teaches courses in public relations, persuasion, and public political communication. He received his BS and MS in communication with a focus on political communication and public relations from Illinois State University, and received his PhD in communication from the University of Missouri, where he focused on political campaign communication, media studies, and image repair. Corey's research interests are in political campaign communication, public rhetoric, and corporate and political image repair. Outside of academia, Corey designed and implemented curriculum and coordinated logistics for high school age students at leadership and technology themed conferences ranging in size from 200 to 1,700 students at gatherings in California, New York, and the Washington, D.C. area. Prior to that experience, Corey worked as an appropriations analyst for the Illinois Senate, briefing state senators, including then State Senator Obama, on the policy and political implications of pending budget legislation. He also has been a paid field operative for several political campaigns at multiple levels across the country. Corey lives in Whitewater with his wife and 3 children. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Corey Davis.
Thank you, Carrie. And thank you to those of you who are with us live today, and to those of you who are watching this later. Welcome to that audience as well. I've done several Fairhaven lectures in the past, and of course disappointed that I can't be there in person to deliver the presentation this year. I know I've delivered addresses before on the topic of the campaign or political campaigns. I believe 4 times before. I know at least one of those was previously on convention addresses, and I know I believe I also spoke a couple other occasions on the topic of debates. And I'm going to be speaking on convention addresses as well today, but whereas those other addresses that I've shared with the Fairhaven community have applied a theory called the functional theory of campaign discourse or political campaign discourse, looking at the difference in attacks, in statements of self-praise and statements of defense between the different candidates, and looking at how they varied on policy and character. I'm doing something a little bit different this time. So I'm not going to be getting into quite as much quantitative data because today, really, the lecture is going to focus on more of a thematic analysis. So for the research we're talking about today, we are going to once again revisit the evolution of nominating conventions, but we're going to talk about a convention, and for that matter, a campaign like no other. We're going to look at the 2020 convention addresses, but we're really going to zero in on the role of COVID-19. And of course, it consumes so much of our lives. It's consumed so many lives, and certainly has affected billions, if not trillions, of other lives. So I'll take you through the history of conventions. I'll talk about how this convention is unique, and about how conventions, although they've changed over the years, they really are still an important component of the American political campaign process and how we choose a president. I'll talk about the role of COVID-19, and within that, we'll talk about some dominant themes and how really we'll see that the president and the vice president and the Democratic nominee for president and vice president, as that they talked about a lot of common themes, but sometimes they talked about those themes in some different ways. And then I'll wrap up. And for those of you who are live with us, hopefully we can take some questions via Carrie's moderation. So without any further ado, let's jump into conventions. So for the first century plus of our history, really probably more like 150 years of our American history, conventions functioned as the main venue for how we selected our presidential and vice presidential nominees. And actually, if you know your presidential history or your American history, you know that initially, for the first couple years, for the first couple election cycles, it actually worked as the president that was the chief vote getter, and the second place vote winner became the vice president. That's how we ended up with two political and ideological rivals, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, were the first and second vote getters, and they ended up being the president and vice president. But as you know, eventually we changed models, and we have now a party ticket system where the president and vice president are selected together on the same ticket. So the convention then became the device by which we selected both our president and vice president. And in those days, well, initially in the early days of the country, we really didn't have much of a primary election system at all. And eventually, when the primaries did evolve and when we had a more sophisticated or at least more formal system of primary elections and caucuses, they really served only on an advisory basis. And in other words, there were far fewer binding primaries. And we know that, through the controversy of the Obama and Clinton primary, or Hillary Clinton, that is, and later the Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders primaries, that really up until 2016, there were many primaries still today that were not entirely binding. But in place of that, in place of those binding primaries, where whoever won the primary was guaranteed to be the nominee, we had these conventions, and we had backroom deals, and we had convention floor fights, and we had a system where really voters would tune in on a nightly basis in August and be treated to live television where we got to see democracy in action. And sometimes it was messy. And one of the messier conventions, of course, in our history was in 1968. Hubert Humphrey didn't campaign in a single primary election. And even 4 years later, in 1972, Ed Muskie, the man from Maine, as he was called, really just racked up primary win after primary win, and then it got to the convention, and all of a sudden George McGovern emerged out of nowhere, and that was everybody. Not nearly the chaos that we saw 4 years earlier in 1968 when party bosses selected Humphrey amid the chaos on the convention floor and the violence out in the streets of Chicago, but in the wake of those chaotic convention years of 1968, and to a slightly lesser degree, but still a great deal of confusion in 1972, both parties really radically changed the way that they selected candidates. The primary elections really started to take more of a foothold in terms of the importance that they played in choosing presidential candidates. And what we saw is that in place of convention floor fights, in place of backroom negotiations, well, maybe the backroom negotiations still happened, but we did see more binding primaries. But when those backroom deals did take place, when primaries did place, that was really sort of all figured out ahead of time. So we really haven't had any conventions in the last 40 years where we didn't know ahead of time who was going to be the nominee. And with that uncertainty, went away the suspense, went away the drama, went away the appeal of the live television event. And instead of the suspense and live drama and the anything can happen feel, we ended up with speeches that were aimed for home viewing audiences, and that they were taking advantage of the free airtime. In other words, conventions became basically hours long, if not days long, infomercials for each party's candidates. And with that decline in suspense, we also saw a decline in ratings. Uh, because if there's not a lot of uncertainty, and if you know who you're going to vote for, really, only the hardcore politicos or political junkies are going to be tuning in. So here's some Nielsen ratings, and if you're not familiar with the Nielsen ratings, they represent the percentage of households with televisions watching the convention during prime time hours. Now, these ratings go up through 2012, and really the Nielsen ratings, we can't lean entirely on those, especially in 2020 and 2016, and probably even going back to 2012 and 2008, because so many more people aren't watching television via satellite or cable and or broadcast. That many more households, millions are watching via streaming channels, and maybe streaming channels like Hulu Live or YouTube TV, but also just watching them streaming on YouTube or watching them streaming from their chosen party's website. But either way, you can see, and I think my pointer will show up there for you, that we've seen a steady decline, whereas nearly a third of the country, or I should say nearly a third of the televisions were tuned to those addresses back in 1960, 1964, 1968, that with a few exceptions, we've seen a steady decline to a low point of 2004, when only 14 or 15% of households were tuned in to watch those 2004 nominating conventions, when George W. Bush was running for re-election and when John Kerry was accepting the Democratic nomination. Now, in terms of raw numbers, we have estimates that in 2020, a nightly average of 21.6 million people watched the Democratic convention, and 19.4 million watched the Republican convention. So those are this year's conventions, and really for both, that represented about roughly a 25% decline from 2016. And then again, this is just the raw numbers of people that watch those debates. I'm sorry, not the debates, the convention addresses. Specifically, and now keep in mind that the conventions are an event that span multiple nights, and they have different speakers over the course of several hours on several nights in a row. But these next group of numbers focus in specifically on the viewership for the presidential nominees' acceptance addresses. So Obama's 2012 speech drew 35.7 million people. Romney's speech drew 30.2 million. Trump's 2016 speech viewed by 32.2 million. So that's an improvement on the Republican viewership of Romney's address 4 years earlier, but it's still well behind the 35.7 number for 2012 and Obama. Hillary Clinton's speech, not as many viewers as Trump, and really slightly behind Romney's numbers, and well behind Obama's numbers, drawing only 29.8 million viewers. And this past August, the most recent addresses, Trump's 2020 speech viewed by 23.8 million. So obviously a really sharp drop from his own numbers in just 4 years earlier. And Biden's speech, obviously, even though he edged out Trump, that's a considerable drop, certainly from Trump's numbers of 30.2, but even a sharp drop of over 5 million decline from Hillary Clinton's speech in 4 years earlier. So all of this is to say is that the conventions don't have the same number of people that they used to. However, that doesn't make them insignificant. And certainly, whenever we have nearly 25 million or over 30 or over 35 million people in America watching something, that's significant. And even though these numbers might have declined or dwindled, and certainly since we don't have the third of the television audience, very few events, if any, in our country draw that kind of television viewing audience. It's really reserved for events like the Super Bowl, are the only thing that come close to drawing roughly a third of the viewing audience. And the fact is that back in the 1960s, 1970s, when we only had 3 TV channels, you could always be assured that roughly a third of the country was watching one of 3 channels. Well, we have a much more fractured audience these days. And mass communication scholars like myself will sometimes debate and question if there even is such thing as a mass audience anymore. But for events like these, where you still have 23.8 or 24.6 million people watching a single live event, and again, that's on the televisions. That's we don't actually have the numbers, the raw numbers for all the different streaming opportunities where people could have been watching them additionally. It's still a very important event. And NES or National Election Study data suggest that 10 to 13% of voters make their choices during the conventions. So those of us, who may be strong partisans on the left or the right, or may have, strong party loyalty and vote the same straight ticket for Republican or Democrat cycle after cycle, we may look at that number and of undecided voters, that percentage of undecided voters every time we see a poll, and say, who are these people who haven't made up their mind yet? How can anyone not support Donald Trump? Or on the other side, how can anyone support Donald Trump? But there are still undecided voters. And for those of you who are undecided voters in the viewing audience, live or watching later, understandably, the conventions present an opportunity to truly see what these candidates stand for, because they talk a great deal about policy and they talk a great deal about character. And those are elements that are important to many voters in deciding who they're going to vote for. Now, compared to the debates, they don't draw as many undecided voters, but they still do serve as an introduction, certainly to candidates who are late to turn in the campaign, certainly for those who are not following the day-by-day developments of a political campaign that's now spans typically over 2 years. And of course, a big segment of that viewing audience are those strong partisans, are the party faithful who really want to see Trump stick it to the libs, or who really want to see Joe Biden rebuke Donald Trump, or who really want to hear from some other voices in the party on the non presidential nights, when they get to hear from other voices in their party, up and coming voices, new voices. And because those conventions are also an opportunity to introduce new and upcoming or rising stars in the respective parties. But of course, we settle on 2020, and this convention truly was a convention like no other. And it's a convention like no other in part because 2020, on a number of fronts, of course, has been a year like no other. I don't need to tell anyone in the audience this. Even people, I flatter myself by thinking people will go back and look at this video 100 years from now. But even people looking at this video historically, or looking at this lecture historically will know that 2020 was a historic era. So of course, once again, like 1968, we've got a country in turmoil. We have violence and protests filling the streets across the country. But in many ways, the coronavirus era conventions that we saw last month are even more historic than 1968, because in spite of the violence we saw in Chicago at that Democratic convention, there were still Democrats gathered in person inside that convention hall. That wasn't the case right here in Wisconsin. Where we were supposed to have the Democratic convention this year in Milwaukee. It wasn't the case in Charlotte, where we were supposed to have the Republican convention meet this year. Instead, Joe Biden delivered his speech from his home state of Delaware. Jill Biden delivered her first lady's candidates, or the candidate to be the next first lady, delivered her address from a schoolroom where she used to teach in her days as a high school teacher. Melania Trump delivered her speech. I believe I think was from the White House, and Trump, notably President Trump, and somewhat controversially, delivered the speech from the White House lawn with some spectators or in presence, and of course that caused a great deal of controversy as well. Not only the fact there were legal allegations that he was misusing public property or improperly using public property for political purposes, but also just the public health controversy of having that many live spectators assembled for his address. But aside from the context of how the actual speeches were delivered, we have the backdrop of the terrible purge that this virus has caused, the terrible toll that this virus has taken worldwide, and now here in the United States, more deaths than anywhere else. As of today, I looked at the update numbers for you for today, which is September 28th, for those of you watching later. 7.15 million cases nationwide, 33.2 million worldwide, 205,000 deaths, nearly a billion globally, 999,000 now. And of course, trillions of dollars, tens of trillions of dollars lost in the global economy. And of course, a central topic of the US presidential campaign, which brings us to the focus of my lecture. Now, if you are to watch a live sporting event, like maybe if you watched the Packers game last night, I apologize to those of you who noticed my Bears logo. But if you were to watch the television broadcast of really any NFL game yesterday, you saw plenty of television ads sponsored by President Trump and his allies to reelect him, and by former Vice President Joe Biden and his allies who want to elect him. And any other television live event, whether it's the nightly news or a baseball game, you're going to see plenty of those TV ads. But as I mentioned before, we don't have that many important live television events anymore. And certainly, earlier this spring, we had hardly any live television because there were no live sports. There was nothing going on. So we want to look beyond traditional television advertising to radio advertising, to online streaming radio, to online streaming television, to click-through ads, as they're known, where you have to watch an ad before you can watch a YouTube video, or before you have to watch an ad, and not a YouTube video necessarily for a newscast, or a YouTube necessarily for a sport, or for a political speech, but you might have to be required to watch one of those click-through YouTube ads just to view a how-to video, or just to watch a cooking video. So we want to make so certainly scholars are looking at that type of political campaign communication. Certainly, they're looking at social media sponsored posts, whether it's on popular forums like Facebook and Snapchat and Twitter or Instagram. And the debates start tomorrow. Debate, in case you weren't aware, that the first debate is tomorrow night, and we'll have a vice presidential debate, and we'll have two more debates after tomorrow, but between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And those will be opportunities of campaign communication. And of course, the convention addresses. And in all of these, no, COVID-19 is not the only issue discussed. It's not the only focus of these many different channels of campaign communication, but it's a major one. It's a central one. And when we look at the polling numbers, when we look at the issues that voters are most concerned with, COVID-19 is the top of the heap. And shortly or closely behind is concerns about and anxieties about the economy, anxieties about job losses. And guess what? It's economic anxieties brought on by COVID-19. It's job loss brought on by COVID-19. So there's no denying that the central role that this terrible virus is going to have, and has already had in this campaign. So what I did was, I mentioned earlier, is I analyzed Republican convention addresses. Uh, I didn't analyze all of the convention addresses across all of the nights, but I did analyze some of the featured speakers. So I looked at the convention addresses on the Republican side from Mike Pence, from Melania Trump and from Donald Trump. And on the Democratic side, I looked at vice presidential nominee Kamala Harris, and then former Vice President Joe Biden, and then his spouse Jill Biden. Now, you're not going to see any quotes that I'm going to share. None of the quotes that I'm going to share with you are from Melania Trump, and it's not that I hold her any ill will or wanted to cut her out of this. But believe it or not, there was no mention of COVID-19 in her convention address. There were some vague mentions to tough times, to perseverance, but no specific mention of the virus, no specific mention of any other themes that were really, universal across all the other speeches. Now, Jill Biden, her speech did not focus as much as did the other addresses from the other four speakers, but she did at least speak specifically to some issues of COVID-19 and education. But overall, with the remaining speakers, with Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence, and with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, we saw some common themes. However, even though there might have been some common themes, as you're going to see, there were differences in how those themes were addressed. There were differences in how those themes were framed. And we saw some divergence in terms of who the different parties and their leaders believe is to blame for the scourge of COVID-19. So the first theme that we really saw across most of the speeches, certainly across the speeches given by the president and vice presidential candidates, was the medical response, so having to do with the medical response. And the treatment advances, therapies, vaccine development, testing, these issues within the broader theme of medical response were discussed over and over again. Excuse me. So in their discussion of the theme of medical response, President Trump and Vice President Pence tended to praise the achievements and the advancements made and to promote the research in progress. So, for example, here's a quote by President Trump. We developed a wide array of effective treatments, including a powerful antibody treatment known as convalescent plasma. You saw that? Remember, he's speaking to a live audience on the White House lawn. So he's reacting to their applause. On Sunday night, when we announced it, that will save thousands and thousands of lives. Thanks to advancements, we have pioneered the fatality rates. And you look at it, and you look at the numbers, it has been reduced by 80% since April. Now, I'm not here to fact check those figures, but he is promoting, he's touting the achievements that his administration, that research sponsored by his administration, that private industry sponsored by his administration has accomplished. In terms of pioneering the fatality rates, I believe that's probably a misspeak. I think what he probably means is that they've been a pioneer in decreasing the fatality rates is what I think he's trying to say there, but I'm not sure. Vice President Mike Pence, as we speak, we are developing a growing number of treatments known as therapeutics, including convalescent plasma, that are saving lives across America. So as you can see, we've got certainly some common themes, and certainly there's been a concerted effort between the speechwriters and, of course, between the candidates themselves that they're really proud of this advancement of convalescent plasma, and that's something that we specifically saw mentioned in the speeches of Mike Pence and Donald Trump. But in discussing this broad theme of medical response and discussing treatment advances, therapies, vaccine development, testing, they didn't just, as we saw on the previous screen, they didn't just tout the achievements. They didn't just talk up the victories. They also took the opportunity to criticize, or rather to attack those who would criticize what Republicans see as advancements that they've made, or to attack those who would criticize what Republicans view as successes. Here's Vice President Mike Pence. Now, last week, and he's talking about last week at the Democratic convention, so a week previous to the Republican convention. Now, last week, Joe Biden said that no miracle was coming. Well, what Joe does not seem to understand is that America is a nation of miracles. And I'm proud to report that we are on track to have the world's first safe, effective corona vaccine by the end of the year. Now, Joe Biden did say a week earlier, he said that no miracle was coming. Um, but as you know, Mike Pence is a politician throughout his career, both as a governor and senator from the state of Indiana. Has worn his faith on his sleeve and has really, used it, has commodified that faith and politicized that faith to great success in his career. And when Joe Biden says no miracles are coming, saying, suggesting that we have to go after science, Mike Pence responds that, takes it as an insult to say that we shouldn't believe in miracles, or takes it as a, I guess, a poking or a jabbing at Mike Pence. So Mike Pence responds directly to that. Donald Trump also took issue with those who would question the United States' perseverance or their success in responding to coronavirus. The United States has among the lowest case fatality rates of any major country in the world. They do not want you to know those things. And of course, to provide you with greater context there, the they who he's talking about is the media. He's saying that they don't report on that. They don't report on the lowest case fatality rates. And that's sort of an odd phrase, case fatality rates. So we're not exactly sure which cases that he's referring to when he uses that phrase. So it's hard to fact check him on that because he may be referring to fatality rates among certain cases, or fatality rates among certain cases of a certain age group, among fatality rates of a certain case of ethnicity or geographic location or previous health condition. So it's really hard to fact check when we don't know which cases he's referring to or the fatality rates among which cases. So, but there he not only touts that success, but he also takes shots at the media as he is prone to do. So someone who has attacked the media a multitude of times throughout his political career. Democrats also talked about medical response. They also used that theme of treatment advances and therapies, of testing and vaccine development. But Democrats primarily, while speaking somewhat prospectively in terms of what they would do differently, they also talked about the failures of the Trump administration. Here's Joe Biden. We lead the world in confirmed cases. We lead the world in deaths. And after all this time, the president still doesn't have a plan. Well, I do. If I'm president, on day one, we'll implement the national strategy I've been laying out since March. We'll develop and deploy rapid tests with results available immediately. So what Joe Biden is trying to do here is first of all, he's preemptively defending against any claims by the Trump administration that they've done a good job. And that, of course, as we just saw with the Republicans actually speaking later, we saw that didn't stop them, that they were still happy to tout their alleged successes or their view what they saw as successes. But he attacks the president's lack of a plan, according to Joe Biden, but says that they will have a plan, and says that even though the Trump administration says they've been doing testing, that they'll have what he calls rapid tests with immediate results. So that's I'm sorry. So to recap, that's the theme of medical response. Another common theme that we saw across several speakers was the theme of mourning the losses of our fellow Americans, mourning losses worldwide, and really all of the speakers, even Melania Trump in her vague reference to a time of mourning or a time of grieving, referenced this indirectly. So Donald Trump said, many Americans, including me, I have sadly lost friends and cherished loved ones to this horrible disease. As one nation, we mourn, we grieve, we hold in our hearts forever the memories of all of those lives that have so tragically been taken so unnecessary. Democratic speakers did the same as well. But some speakers, especially Kamala Harris, I apologize, it's not attributed on the screen. Kamala Harris gives us this next quote. So she, as President Trump did, also mourned the losses we've experienced as a nation, but did so while also pointing out the inequality in the losses. And again, this is Kamala Harris. I'm sorry it's not attributed there on the screen. And we are a nation that's grieving the loss of life, the loss of jobs, the loss of opportunities, the loss of normalcy, and yes, the loss of uncertainty. And while this virus touches us all, let's be honest, it is not an equal opportunity offender. Black, Latino, and Indigenous people are suffering and dying disproportionately. And again, that's Vice Presidential candidate and U.S. Senator from California, Kamala Harris. Another common theme was praising frontline healthcare workers and teachers. And as you'll see in these quotes, a variety of other different types of frontline or essential workers. And really all the speakers universally praised the efforts of these essential workers, especially healthcare workers. Here's another quote from Kamala Harris. We see it in the doctors, the nurses, the home healthcare workers, and the frontline workers who are risking their lives to save people they've never met. We see it in the teachers and the truck drivers, the factory workers and farmers, the postal workers and the poll workers, all putting their own safety on the line to help us get through this pandemic. And again, that's Kamala Harris. Mike Pence expressed similar sentiment, also praising frontline healthcare workers and teachers. Our country does not get through such a time unless its people find strength within. The response of doctors, nurses, first responders, farmers, factory workers, truckers, and everyday Americans who put the health and safety of their neighbors first has been nothing short of heroic. And again, that was Vice President Mike Pence. So unlike the other themes where we saw some divergent framing, where we saw the opportunity, we saw speakers of both parties take the opportunity to take shots at their political opponents, even when touting successes. We don't really see the partisanship in this theme. And that's of course refreshing and reassuring. Is that maybe there is something that we can agree on? That we can agree that we should be thankful to our doctors and nurses and home healthcare workers and other frontline workers. So there perhaps is some promise. Perhaps there is some common ground that can be found. And certainly there's common ground in terms of that we're all concerned with this issue. But in this case, we don't diverge in the theme, and really there's nearly identical sentiments expressed between that of Kamala Harris and Mike Pence, the two vice presidential nominees. Apologize, just a second. For some reason, all right, sorry, my slides weren't advancing for a moment. Here we go. So to wrap up, to summarize, of course, as I went into great detail, conventions have changed over the years in form and viewership, and for a number of reasons. And obviously, 2020 is unlike any other convention cycle because 2020 is unlike any year that any of us have experienced. And the themes of nearly all convention addresses touched on COVID-19. Remember, I say nearly all convention addresses because I did mention that the Melania Trumps did not ever specifically mention coronavirus, although there were some vague references to a time of uncertainty and mourning. Common themes included medical response, mourning losses rather, and praising essential workers. And the themes may have been similar, but especially in the case of medical response and mourning losses, were definitely framed differently. However, as I just noted, that really the common ground, the similarly framed themes was right there with praising essential workers. So there was some convergence there. So I thank you for tuning in today. And at this time, I will ask Carrie Bourne to help me moderate. If there are any questions in the discussion section from our live viewership, if they've hung in this long, I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you for your time. And thank you to those of you who are viewing later as well. Sorry, Carrie, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. have a small audience here. This is only our second lecture, so we're still sort of like navigating how to work the some of the things out. So I'm going to give people a little bit of time to actually type, kind of digest what they heard.
Sure, sure.
So we'll give people a little bit of time if they do want to ask questions. As we know, even when we're in Fairhaven, the questions from the audience is usually our favorite part, is when we can engage with people. So we're living in this virtual world now where we don't get to engage as much. So we really do encourage anybody to ask questions. One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking was you analyzed the convention speeches and found those themes. Have you noticed, I mean, we're in Wisconsin, I think we're probably getting more ads. It's a really battleground state, so we're getting ads all over the place, TV or social media, all over the place. Have those same sorts of themes from the convention speeches been in some of the ads we're seeing on TV or in our social media or anything?
Yeah. Certainly they have been. I've seen some ads from both campaigns thanking the frontline workers, thanking healthcare workers. That it's basically like a thank you ad, and we've seen lots of those ads from corporations too. We saw them throughout the summer, where it would just be like images of hospital workers or other frontline workers or truckers, and then at the end just thank you and the corporate logo. So we've seen political versions of that too, where it's been pictures of heroic frontline workers, and then thank you, Joe Biden for president, thank you Donald Trump for president. We've also seen the theme of the response or testing and the medical response to COVID-19, the public health response. That has definitely been a major campaign. It's been a major attack point for the Biden campaign. The Biden campaign has several television ads out there, several web video ads out there that feature the recordings of the president and using the president's own words, where he gave the famous quote, "One day it'll just poof and it'll be gone, it'll disappear, and it'll be like it was never there." And the Biden campaign has used video, has used the quote of that instance several times to then point out the discrepancy between that prediction and the reality where we find ourselves several months later.
Yeah. So we do have a few questions in the chat area here. The first is kind of on earlier in your talk. Someone noted that what led to the change of the vice president based on the second most votes for president? That's a big change. So what led to that change in the convention?
So that was really it was kind of sparked by Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republican Party. And again, I'm not a historian. I sort of have a great deal of presidential history under my belt, just because it's required to study political campaign communication. But it was the Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. So forgive me if I don't get all the details right. They basically were tired of having their administration saddled with a federalist as the vice president, just because the Federalists came in second. So they openly lobbied and then eventually changed the way that the vice president was selected. And I think that happened in the I want to say 18 aughts. It was before the 18 teens. It was pretty early on. I think that really it was just the first couple elections where we had that as the case.
And here is, do you think the lack of conventions had an effect on each party's platforms?
The lack of,
I wonder,
this year, do you think they mean? Or?
I think they mean this year. The sort of the unconventional conventions, did they have an effect on each of the platforms this year?
Yeah. So even though the conventions didn't happen in the literal arena that they normally happen, they still took place. They met over video conferencing, whether it's WebEx or Zoom or whatever. So they still did meet. The Democrats have an official platform. The Republicans, for a while, didn't have a platform, and then they just recently finally released a platform. I don't know if that's a direct. That's a really good question. I don't know if that's a direct result of having unconventional conventions, or if that's a result of having an unconventional president in Donald Trump, who really, relies more on his cult of personality and the following of his base than he does specific policy proposals.
Great. Okay. Another question is, what is the role of third-party candidates in their communication in comparison to other election years?
That's a great observation, and it's really next to none. They've gotten very little notoriety, and I think it's because they played somewhat of a spoiler role, certainly in 2016, not to the extent that we saw played in other historic years for third party candidates. So obviously, at least in recent history, 1992 was a big year for third party candidates, when a lot of historians and political scientists credit the candidacy of Ross Perot for giving the election to Bill Clinton over George H.W. Bush, and then of course in 2000, many political scientists and other scholars and observers and media critics credit Ralph Nader's candidacy with tipping the scales for George W. Bush over Al Gore, certainly in Florida, but elsewhere. And in 2016, we had the Libertarian candidate whose name is escaping me at the moment, had some significant votes, and Jill Stein was the Green Party candidate in 2016, and she also took some significant votes in battleground states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. But I think Jill Stein honestly probably made more headlines a couple years ago when we discovered that a lot of her online promotion was sponsored by Russian intelligence. So I think it's the outsized spoiler role that has caused the third party candidates to be sort of swept under the rug this year. We're not really hearing a lot from them. And I think that's partly because of our partisanship, and because we've become so polarized that there's not even the room for the third party candidates, but also just because I think the perception is that among even the most the furthest ideological extremes in both parties that might otherwise have been tempted to vote for a third party candidate, that they realize it's going to be a close election, and I think they're just sort of locked into to supporting the two mainline parties.
And it looks like we have one more question, and that is, have there been past topics that have become as significant in an election year as COVID-19 in this election?
I think that probably the comparison would be elections held during times of war, because we have stock topics like healthcare, education, economy and jobs, general foreign policy that we come back to year after year after year. And we'll hear questions about all those topics in the debates tomorrow night and next month. But my hunch is that those responses we'll hear some stock responses on economy and jobs and healthcare and education and foreign policy, but they'll be couched in the context of COVID-19. Just as in war years, so in 2004, the Iraq War dominated the debates. The Iraq War dominated the campaign. John Kerry's candidacy was attacked by the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, because despite being an Iraq War veteran himself, a well-decorated Iraq War veteran himself, he was accused of flip-flopping his support for the war, and by extension, they accused him of flip-flopping his support for veterans. But even if we go back and look at those convention addresses and the debates and the ads and the other forms of political campaign communication in a war year like 2004 or 1940 for that matter, we see that that the war dominated everything. So even if we're talking about healthcare, it's talking about healthcare for veterans, or it's talking about how the out party will complain that the in party who launched this war, that it's emptying our treasury and killing our economy, or it's emptying our treasury and depriving us of domestic programs for healthcare and education. So, and I think that's what we're going to see this year is really that's probably the only comparison is to what we've seen in wartime years. So, because when you have a wartime election, that armed conflict is always going to dominate the election campaign communication, and even the topics that aren't specifically about the war, we see framed or referencing the war in some ways. And I think that's what we're seeing this year is that even topics like education. So we talk about funding for education. Well, that's something we talk about every year. And every candidate, both parties, they always want the best education for our children, even if they have different ways of going about it. That's what they claim. But this year, when candidates talk about education, they talk about how weird it is going back to school. They talk about the inequalities of going back to school in affluent neighborhoods with internet access versus going back to school in neighborhoods where there isn't, rural neighborhoods where there's poor internet access, or urban environments where no one's at home to help the online learners. So and of course, healthcare will be dominated by interpretations of COVID-19. So I think that's probably the best comparison to go back to the question is really the wartime comparison.
Yeah, yeah. So that wraps up the questions from the chat area. And so I think we'll probably just leave the lecture, leave it on that note. And normally we would ask to join me in thanking you. Is there one more? No. Oh, okay. There is actually one more quick question here.
Sure.
I think we can get to this. So
Sure.
do you sense a significant difference in how the candidates are approaching COVID-19?
I'll take that to be like a difference between the two candidates.
I think so, yeah. I think,
yes.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, so I would say that the main difference that I've noticed in the convention addresses, but also in general campaign stump speeches and in their other forms of campaign communication I've mentioned, is that Trump is touting successes, and he is being overly optimistic, or if you just want to say optimistic, to whereas sort of that it's a foregone conclusion that we're going to move past this, and that he's already done everything that needs to be done to move us past. Joe Biden obviously has the opposite take, is that that it's not getting better, that it's getting worse. That what has been done hasn't worked, or hasn't been enough, or hasn't been fast enough, or took too long. So it's really, I mean, it's a pretty simple dichotomy between blowing the trumpet of victory and pointing the accusatory finger.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, that was an excellent talk, great discussion. Thank you, Professor Corey Davis, for joining us. And you have been a good friend to the series in the past, and hopefully the next time you join us, we'll actually be in person back at Fairhaven. So thank you to our audience.
Again, thanks a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. Thanks again, Professor Corey Davis, and thank you to our audience online. Have a good night.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.